Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're back in War Thunder on the updates 1.77 stuff, and this is one of the new French aircraft. This is a French Rank 1 battle rating 2.3 bomber, the Martin 167 A-3. You will find it here in the tree just after the Potez 633, and you'll see it has the same BR as the NC 223.3, but just lower than the MB 174. So what do you get out of this aircraft? Well, first of all, we'll have a look at the X-ray. You get two huge fuel tanks, but they are self-sealing, which is kind of nice. You have a back gunner, which has a 7.7mm Vickers machine gun, and also you have a nice little glass area down here, where the gunner can at least see the ground, which isn't that lovely. On top of that, you have one pilot and a bombardier. I don't know why he's labeled as a gunner, but I suppose I've never seen bombardier in the game. Maybe it's just not an option. It is powered by two Pratt & Whitney R1830s S1C3 G 14-cylinder radials with around about 1,000 horsepower each, meaning that this thing at 2.3 has a lot of power behind it. There is also a few little cooling systems here and there, which means that if they generally get hit by anything, you will start springing oil. You will see that there is no actual armor on this machine at all, meaning that wherever you get hit, you're going to take damage no matter what the round is. On top of this, this isn't just a bomber, since it does have some offensive armaments. 4 7.5mm FN Browning machine guns is what you end up with, and the staggering thing in my opinion is the fact that it has 3,200 rounds of ammunition for these offensive armaments, 800 per gun, making them kind of useful. They are pretty spread out on the wings though, so convergence does make a difference, but because it has these guns, it means it can actually be kind of an effective bomber hunter. If we look at the modifications that the Martin can use, the default bomb load is 50 kilogram bombs, which doesn't seem like quite a lot, and that's because it isn't, especially when you compare it to the Farman and the NC 223. But if you get the 50 DT modification, you're able to carry 16, which is a little bit better, but still subpar compared to other machines of a very similar BR. This means that you have to focus on other elements of the machine instead of just its bombing duties. Flight performance is incredibly key if you want to go after these other desired roles, such as a pseudo bomber hunter, but also the turret and offensive 7.5mm can be useful as well. If I was going to suggest how to research this aircraft, first of all you get fuselage radiator, compressor airframe, wings repair engine, offensive 7mm, and then engine injection cover, and then get the rest. If you want to swap it up and actually get some more points while bombing, obviously you pick the 50 DT over the airframe, and then you can go from there. Survivability isn't a really big deal in the Martin. The flight performance is much more important to your overall goals, which should be hunting bombers and trying to bomb. When we talk about the two belts that you get, the 7.7 and the 7.5, the default for the 7.7 is not great, but at 2.3 you run into a lot of lower tier aircraft which don't have a lot of armor, meaning that ball AP can be okay at this level. But it is much better to get some incendiary behind it, so using the universal belts is the way to go. Armored targets, it's IT AP, but universal, you already have the AP, and on top of it, you add the incendiary bullet to it, meaning that fires can be catastrophic to enemy planes from that turret. The offensive 7.5mm is kind of a different story. You get T-ball IAP, which obviously gives you a lot of penetration power, but once again, as I said, armor at this level is not as much of a big deal compared to, let's say, the likes of a 4.0 aircraft. Universal is okay. Traces is the IT belt. I used to love these belts until the French came out, and then realized that they don't penetrate anything, and even against stuff which have no armor, they generally don't do a lot of damage. So stealth for me is the way to go. 2 APs and an eye whereas with the Universal you get an extra eye bullet, but you also get an extra tracer bullet. So if you're struggling to fire these guns in an effective manner, you take Universal. If you are not struggling with that, you take Stealth. If you want to maybe get lucky with random fires, you go for the IT Tracer Belt. But the one that I personally go for is Stealth, just because I'm comfortable with these guns, and also it does a decent amount of damage, especially to enemy bombers. Something you also have to take into account is crew skills are generally not as high as they are at higher levels, so the 7.5s will knock out pilots quite easily as long as they can penetrate through the cabin into them. So yeah, that is something to take into account. It is an okay bomber, but overshadowed in many ways because of the fact that it doesn't have the best bomb load compared to some of its compatriots from other nations, and even as the similar nation that it's in the form of the NC-223. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of history on this aircraft, and then we'll get into some gameplay. The Martin 167 A-3 was a light bomber which was designed for a US Army bomber contest in 1937 to 1938, but it actually entered combat with the French Armée de l'Air before becoming the basis of the RAF's Martin Maryland and Martin Baltimore bombers. Glenn L. Markin was one of 5 companies that designed aircraft to satisfy the Army's 1937 request for a bomber capable of carrying around about 1,200 pounds of bombs with a range of 1,200 miles and a speed of over 200 miles per hour. 3 of those companies were awarded contracts to build prototypes, and all 3 designs would result in production aircraft. At first, the US AAF preferred the North American NA-40, but eventually decided to order the Douglas DB-7, which entered production as the A-20 Havoc, another plane we already have in game. The North American design soon evolved into the NA-62 and entered production as the B-25 Mitchell, which was produced in very large numbers. This only left the Martin Model 167W. Although the French Purchasing Commission had already placed an order for the DB-7, they urgently needed new aircraft to counter the threat posed by Germany. So in January 1939, the French placed an order for 115 models of the 167Ws. 1 month before the prototype's first flight in February 1939, and 2 before its first Army Air Corps test flight of 14th of March 1939. Now, if you've actually watched some of my older content, especially when it comes to French tanks, you'll find that the French Purchasing Commission was very apt at purchasing a bunch of models before even a proper prototype was finished, and generally it didn't go too well when they did it. But this was mainly down to French production issues. The prototype model 167W was powered by Pratt & Whitney R1830-37 twin Wasp engines, which were replaced in French production aircraft by Wright Cyclone 9 engines. The twin Wasps were then restored for the British Maryland. So if we ever actually do get the Martin Maryland in the game for the British, it will at least be slightly different to the French version. All versions of the Model 167 were armed with 6 machine guns, 4 fixed machine guns in the wings, mainly for ground attack, 1 dorsal gun and 1 ventral gun. In the prototype, these guns were all 30-inch Browning machine guns, or 7.7s. The dorsal gun was mounted in a fully retractable turret, and the French aircraft used license-built Belgian Fabrique Nationale FN Brownings, and used a lighter semi-retractable dorsal turret. The weight saved helped to increase the top speed to 288 miles per hour. So once again, another difference that we may see between the British version of the Maryland, or the Martin Maryland, and the Martin 167 from the French, different armament. The Model 167 was a fairly typical twin-engine bomber. The crew of 3 were carried in 2 isolated compartments, pilot and bombardier in the nose, and the gunner in a separate rear compartment isolated by a bulkhead. The most unusual feature of the Model 167 was the very narrow width of the fuselage. This meant that the two compartments were not able to actually interact in a physical way. Glenn L. Martin doubled the size of their Baltimore factory and built all 115 aircraft in 6 months, but they were then prevented from delivering them by a US arms embargo. Despite this, the French placed an order for another 100 aircraft. The embargo was finally lifted in October 1939, and the 115 aircraft from the first order were delivered by the end of November 1939, so very efficient on the Americans' end. After this very speedy start, things started to slow down, and only 25 of the second batch of aircraft had reached France before the armistice of June 1940. The Model 167 was given the French designation Martin 167A-3 for Army Support 3 Place, and was known as the Glenn. When the aircraft first reached the RAF, it was often known simply as the Glenn Martin bomber, so that is where the name Glenn comes from. French bomber aircraft were organized into wings, or escadres, which were divided into Groupe de Bombardement, or bomber groups, so thus GB-162 was Groupe de Bombardement 1 of Escadre 62. The Glenn was used to equip GB-1 and 262 and GB-1 and 263, each with 12 to 18 aircraft for a total of around about 48 to 72 aircraft. By the 10th of May 1940, GB-162 and 163 had completed their training and were stationed in the southwest of France, while GB-262 and 263 were trained in North Africa. Although the Glenn had been designed as a ground attack aircraft, the French had decided to use them as level bombers, and the Glens did not fly their first sorties in the Battle of France until the 22nd of May, by which time the battle had already been lost. Between then and the 14th of June, the four groups flew 363 sorties. They operated at between 300 and 3,000 feet. The Glens suffered 17 losses, most of them to German flak, accounting for at least a quarter of their original strength. More aircraft were lost on the ground. On the 10th of June, Italy declared war on France, and on the 15th of June, the surviving Glens were moved south. Between the 15th and the 24th of June, 55 sorties were flown, this time for only a single loss. The Italians made no progress against determined French resistance, but the main battle was being lost in the north, and on the 25th of June the armistice was signed, ending the fighting. By this date, the surviving Glens had escaped to Mali and Senegal. The Vichy French government was allowed to retain a limited air force in North Africa, and the Glenn would see as much combat against the Allies as against the Germans. They took part in the defense of Dakar in September 1940, attacked Gibraltar on the 24th to 25th of September, took part in the bitter fighting in Syria in June-July of 1941, and finally came up against the American forces invading Morocco at the start of Operation Torch. Very few Martin 167A-3s survived the fighting in Syria and Morocco. So that is pretty much the story of the Martin 167A-3. What is to actually take out from it is the fact that this aircraft was not as successful as some of its other US compatriots which went over to the French, such as the H-75, but it was still a solid light bomber which was able to fill a duty. Heavy losses obviously didn't help it that much, but at least there was some promise seen in it. This isn't an A-35 level, which was used by the British as well, but mainly as a target towing aircraft. This actually was used in more of an aggressive role instead of being useless once it was created. It was seen as a competitive aircraft and was used as so by the French, and hopefully if we see it in the British tree, I'll be able to talk about the Maryland and the Baltimore bombers once they are introduced. Let's get on to some gameplay. When it comes to the gameplay elements of the Martin 167A-3, it is definitely different to what you may expect. A lot of people will look at this aircraft and compare it to stuff like the Blenheim and the Beaufort, and they aren't wrong to do so, especially when they look at the bomb load they look at the general look of the machine, they look at the speed, the maneuverability and all of this. But what has to be said, where the Blenheim and the Beaufort fall apart, the Martin 167 is able to do quite well. And this is the offensive armament of it. 4 7.5mm machine guns against the majority of aircraft you're going to face, especially bombers, is going to be good enough to be able to take them apart. Now, a few American bombers you may struggle with, but generally you face Germany and sometimes Japan in this, meaning that you are facing DO-17s, the early HE-111s, sometimes Sparvieros if you run into them, and also Ju-88s. So this machine actually counteracts them quite well in an aggressive, offensive role as kind of a bomber hunter. It is definitely fun to use it in that role, but there are definitely some downsides. The first one being that there is absolutely no protection for your pilots, so you have to make sure when you go in these aggressive roles going after enemy bombers that your pilot is always moving, so they can't just turret him down, which has definitely happened to me a few times. And you don't have to worry about if you miss a few shots. 3,200 rounds for 4 guns is an insane amount of ammunition for this level. So if you miss a few, don't worry too much. You will be able to kill it. It also has a bomber sight, which is always nice, especially since it has a bombardier, so it makes sense. So hitting targets such as bases and the like is very easy to do. Now, my general game plan with the Martin 167 when I go into a battle is to fly it out at bomber altitude as usual, go to the see the enemy bombers as they pass you, maybe take a pot shot at them, but carry on to one of the enemy bases. Drop all of your bombs on the enemy base, turn around, and then go after the bombers. This does mean that the bombers for the enemy will get to their target location before that you're able to kill them. So if you want to be able to take them out before they get to their target location, you're going to have to be a little bit more aggressive than my playstyle. But I feel like bombers generally are going to get to their destination anyway, and you can make some points out of it by getting to their bases as well. So you're pretty much benefiting the enemy slightly and benefiting yourself as well, and then at the end of the day you get to kill them, so you benefit a little bit more. If we talk about the defensive capabilities of the Martin 167 against other fighters, it is definitely better to try and outmaneuver them or outrun them than to actually defend yourself using the back gunner. If you've ever used this back gunner or will ever use it, something you must understand is it cannot go below the horizontal. The way that the gun is mounted in the back, the 7.7mm Vickers K machine gun, it cannot point down, meaning that you can only cover yourself from the horizontal upwards, and even then you are limited to where you can shoot. It also has the wonderful first person mode, which is really nice to see. It does look absolutely beautiful on this aircraft, but when it comes to actually defending yourself, it is not the gun that you may want. There are much better turrets at this level, which are situated on stuff like the German aircraft, such as the Ju-88A4 with its 7.92 rapid firing machine guns looking backwards. So you can't depend on the defensive armament, so what you have to do is use your speed, which generally is good enough to get away from everything apart from stuff like HE-100s, which will outdive you, and also use your maneuverability, which is pretty good for a large light bomber in this regard. It is labelled as a frontline bomber, meaning that it doesn't get the air spawn of a heavy bomber, and if we compare it to other heavy bombers that the French have, such as the Farman and the NC-223.3, it is very hard to take the Martin over them. The NC-223 does a wonderful job of being able to annihilate enemy fortifications in forms of bases and also in forms of airfields. If you take 4 of these out, it is very easy to end a game incredibly quickly, just like the Farman. So if we talk about a pure bomber role, the Martin is always going to lose out to these aircraft unless they get their BR changed. And this is a argument that I talked about with the MB174 A-3. It has the same issue in that regard. It does not have the bomb load in order to compete with these Behemoths. So in order to use it effectively, you have to use it in its secondary role, of being an offensive powerhouse to annihilate enemy bombers. It is kind of hard at this level for a lot of machines to be able to climb to the altitude of bombers, especially if you're in specific fighters. And if we look at the French fighters, the only ones which are capable of doing that at this level is probably the D520 at 2.7 and the VG-33C-1. They can climb to the level of bombers by the time the bombers are getting back to their own airfields, but everything else is going to struggle even to be as fast as the bombers at those altitudes that they spawn at. So it is up to you in the Martin to be able to take out those bombers, which it is definitely equipped to do. But just understand you can do stuff with the bombs if you want to, but it is much better to see this as an out-and-out attacker aircraft which gets a bomber airspawn instead of the frontline bomber that they want to label it as. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you for watching.